In December 1944, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Snow lay heavy on the fences of America's heartland as the war's final winter began. Inside the wire, silence waited for dawn. The sun had not yet broken the horizon when the camp loudspeaker crackled to life. A cold mist hung over the wire, wrapping the rows of wooden barracks in silence. Inside, German women sat on their bunks, coats pulled tight, waiting for the sound they dreaded. The bark of an order, the clang of boots, punishment. For weeks, rumors had drifted through the fences that American camps worked their captives to exhaustion, that kindness was a trick, that mercy was weakness. But then came a sound no one expected. The hiss of oil on hot iron, the faint rhythmic clatter of pans. The air filled with the smell of bacon. A few women thought it was a dream, or worse, a taunt. Yet as the minutes passed, guards began to appear, carrying steaming trays and metal cups that glinted in the first light. No shouting, no whips. Only the strange, almost painful scent of breakfast, and the quiet disbelief of women who had prepared for cruelty, not warmth. They had once served under banners and uniforms that promised eternity. By 1945, those promises had turned to ash. Among the prisoners captured across collapsing German lines were not only soldiers, but hundreds of women, radio operators, nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries of the Luftwaffe and the German Red Cross. Many had believed they would never be taken alive. Capture, they were told, was dishonor. Yet, in the final months of the war, surrender was no longer a choice. It was survival. When the Allied advance overran the Western Front, columns of captured German personnel stretched for miles. American transport units received strict orders: segregate the female prisoners, document them, and transfer them under Geneva Convention protections. The orders came directly from the War Department. The United States wanted the world to see a clear difference between its treatment of captives and the reports emerging from Europe's brutal labor and concentration camps. By early spring, ships began carrying these women across the Atlantic. Their journey was long, cold, and uncertain. Many were still wearing the remnants of their field uniforms, insignia stripped, their futures unknown. The American guards on board were instructed to maintain formality, but avoid cruelty. Meals were standardized: white bread, potatoes, canned meat, and strong coffee. A menu that astonished those who had lived on turnips and thin soup for months. When the transport ships reached the eastern seaboard, convoys of trucks took the prisoners inland to camps scattered across states like Wisconsin, Iowa, and Texas. Each camp was built to mirror the standards set by the War Department's Prisoner of War Administration. Wooden barracks, mess halls, medical stations, and recreation yards. Compared to the ruins of Germany, the sight of organized streets, electricity, and clean water felt surreal. Still, fear lingered. Many of the captured women expected interrogation, punishment, or worse. Propaganda had painted Americans as monsters, rich, ruthless, and vengeful. They whispered these warnings to one another as they marched through the gates of Camp McCoy, Camp Swift, or Fort Oglethorpe. Some wept silently, others clenched their fists. The first night was sleepless. Floodlights burned against the wire, and guards patrolled in silence. The women huddled beneath thin blankets, hearing distant train whistles, unfamiliar insects, and the creak of wooden floors. Everything was foreign, even the silence itself. Yet among those assigned to supervise them were officers trained not in punishment but in psychology. The United States Army's prisoner of war policy emphasized that discipline could coexist with humanity. A calm-fed prisoner was less likely to revolt, more likely to cooperate. It was not mercy, it was method. That method would show itself most clearly the next morning, when the mess hall fires were lit and the smell of frying bacon rose into the cold dawn air. An aroma that would travel across the wire and rewrite every fear the German prisoners still clung to. When the trucks rolled through the wooden gates of the American prisoner of war compounds, the women saw a world that defied everything they had been told. Rows of barracks stood in perfect order. The fences were real, but so were the flower beds beside them. Instead of the chaos and shouting they had imagined, there were posted schedules, bulletin boards, and guards who addressed them as Miss or Ma'am. It felt less like captivity and more like a strange, disciplined village. Inside the camp, life moved by the whistle. Reveille at dawn, roll call in the yard, meals in the mess hall, lights out at 9. Each day began with one sound the women learned to recognize before all others: the clang of the cook's ladle against a steel pot. The mess hall was the heart of the compound. It was here that the first shock of peace collided with the memory of war. American military cooks worked from standard War Department menus designed for both troops and prisoners. Every breakfast followed the same formula: scrambled eggs or oatmeal, bread or pancakes, fruit syrup if available, and always bacon or sausage. The food came from an enormous wartime supply chain that stretched from Midwestern farms to cold storage trains and field kitchens. Even during rationing, the United States produced more food than it could consume. For the prisoners, that abundance bordered on the miraculous. Reports from the Red Cross inspections describe astonishment during the first week. One German nurse admitted she had not seen real coffee in 3 years. Another wrote that she felt guilty eating meat while her family back home boiled weeds for soup. Many wept silently over their trays, unsure whether gratitude was permitted. To the American camp administrators, this reaction was expected and even encouraged. The office of the Provost Marshal General had issued guidelines that every camp should remain a demonstration of American principles. Humane treatment was not only a moral decision, it was psychological warfare. Feeding prisoners well served multiple purposes. It prevented illness, reduced hostility, and projected an image of moral superiority that the enemy could neither ignore nor deny. Guards were instructed to avoid mockery. There would be no jeering, no deliberate humiliation. Instead, there was structure, work details, reading hours, even small concerts. But nothing spoke louder than the morning meal. When the camp loudspeaker announced breakfast, fear loosened its grip a little. The line to the mess hall became the quiet ceremony of a new routine. Behind the serving counter, American cooks moved quickly, sleeves rolled, grease popping on the griddle. The smell of bacon, coffee, and baked bread drifted beyond the walls into the frosty air. Some guards joked that you could follow the aroma all the way to the perimeter fence. For the women inside their barracks, that scent became the first sign that the day might not bring punishment. Across hundreds of camps, similar moments repeated. In Georgia, Oklahoma, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Local newspapers occasionally mentioned them, describing the sight of uniformed German women walking to breakfast under the watch of quiet guards. Rural Americans who once saw the enemy only through propaganda posters now saw frightened human faces. And for the prisoners, every plate of food challenged what they had believed about their captors. Still, not everyone accepted the kindness easily. Some prisoners refused to eat at first, fearing the food might be tainted or that acceptance would mean betrayal. Others ate in silence, tears mixing with steam from the trays. Gradually, suspicion eroded. The warmth of the food, the predictability of the schedule, and the absence of cruelty began to replace terror with something dangerously close to trust. Within weeks, discipline in the camp improved. Work assignments were completed on time. Escape attempts dropped. When Red Cross representatives arrived for inspection, they found the female sections remarkably calm. One American officer wrote in his report, "A fed prisoner is a thinking prisoner. A thinking prisoner is one who remembers." And that was precisely the goal. The United States was fighting a global war not only with weapons, but with ideals. Behind the wire, every breakfast served was a message that democracy, even in victory, could choose compassion over vengeance. Soon, those ideals would be tested in ways neither side expected. When the first winter storms arrived, and rations had to be stretched without breaking faith with the promise that no prisoner would ever again wake to hunger. For the German women behind the barbed wire, hunger had become more than an empty stomach. It was a lesson in control. During the final months of the war, food had been rationed into obedience. A handful of bread could buy silence. A bowl of soup could buy loyalty. They had lived under a system where deprivation was discipline. So when the guards placed steaming trays in their hands, they didn't know how to respond. Some looked for hidden motives, a test, a punishment disguised as kindness. But the Americans said nothing. They served, nodded, and moved to the next person in line. One prisoner later recalled, "We waited for the slap, for the insult, but it never came. They only said, 'Eat before it gets cold.'" That single line, spoken without superiority, shattered years of conditioning. In that moment, fear began to fracture. These women were not soldiers anymore, nor enemies in the field. They were human beings sitting at tables, hearing forks scrape against tin, listening to the low hum of a radio playing American jazz somewhere beyond the mess hall. It was the sound of a different kind of power, one that didn't rely on shouting or punishment. Over time, breakfast became their first ritual of peace. Each morning began with the smell of food instead of gunfire. Each sip of coffee reminded them that even in captivity, life could return to something recognizable, and that realization carried more impact than any speech about democracy. The women had been taught to see Americans as crude materialists, greedy, loud, careless people who knew nothing of discipline or sacrifice. Yet the food told a different story. The American breakfast, rich and heavy with flavor, was not about indulgence. It was about abundance, a confidence that came from factories still running, farms still producing, trains still moving on time. To the prisoners, this abundance was disorienting. In Germany, even officers ate thin slices of bread stretched with sawdust. Butter was a memory. Coffee was ground acorns. Sugar had disappeared long before the war's end. And yet here they were, being offered pancakes, syrup, bacon, and fruit in a land that had never seen bombing, where grocery shelves were full, and where even prisoners could taste what victory smelled like. One nurse wrote later, "The taste of bacon was unbearable. Not because it was bad, because it was too good. We did not feel we had earned it." Cultural identity clashed with survival instinct. Many of these women had grown up believing discipline meant denial. That comfort made people weak. The American system turned that logic upside down. Here, kindness was discipline. Feeding your enemy was strategy. The cooks and guards didn't see it as propaganda. They saw it as procedure. But in the global theater of ideas, every meal served in those camps was a silent broadcast. A message carried home through letters, memories, and post-war interviews. America fed us. When historians later analyzed why German and Japanese prisoners in the United States were less violent, less radicalized, and less likely to resist compared to those held elsewhere, they often returned to this point. The food, they said, wasn't just nourishment. It was persuasion. As winter deepened, that persuasion would be tested. Supply trains slowed, rations tightened, and new groups of prisoners arrived, exhausted, bitter, and skeptical of the Americans' intentions. Yet somehow the mess hall still opened at dawn. The coffee still poured, and the same sizzling sound of bacon on the griddle continued to echo across the camp yards, like a heartbeat of civilization refusing to vanish even in war. To understand how the United States could serve hot breakfast to thousands of enemy captives each morning, one must understand the machinery that made America's war effort unlike any in history. By 1944, the United States Army's Quartermaster Corps had built a supply chain that fed 12 million personnel every day: soldiers, sailors, airmen, and even prisoners. While Europe burned, America's farms thrived. The Midwest alone produced more wheat, pork, and corn than the entire Axis bloc combined. Trains carrying ammunition to the East Coast returned west filled with food, a perfect circular system of logistics. Cold storage cars kept meat fresh for weeks, and canneries operated 24 hours a day. When the German women arrived, the same system that supplied troops in Normandy and the Pacific also supplied the prison camps. Each camp had its own commissary, bakery, and kitchen. Surplus bacon and powdered eggs were delivered in bulk. Even coffee, the luxury elsewhere, came in massive barrels marked U.S. Army property. For the guards and cooks, feeding prisoners was simply another assignment in a vast logistical plan. But for the prisoners, that system represented something larger: control through competence. Every loaf of bread, every tray of breakfast food proved that the United States didn't just win battles. It mastered the art of sustenance. The message was unspoken but clear. This is what power looks like when it is organized. To the untrained eye, generosity might look like mercy. To military psychologists, it was something far more deliberate. By the middle of the war, American strategists had learned that brutality hardened resistance, but comfort dissolved it. A prisoner who felt safe began to think. A thinking prisoner began to question loyalty to a failed regime. In 1943, the Office of the Provost Marshal General released a confidential memorandum titled "The Psychological Value of Humane Treatment." It stated, "A well-treated prisoner of war is an unwitting messenger to his nation. Every act of fairness was a seed planted in the enemy's mind, a living broadcast that would one day return home." That is why breakfast mattered. Food reached places speeches never could. When a German nurse tasted real coffee for the first time in years, she did not think of defeat. She thought of home, of family, of a life that existed before propaganda. In her journal, one guard wrote, "They softened before we ever spoke." The Americans understood the subtle balance, strict discipline by rule, emotional softness by design. Guards were trained to remain distant yet decent. There would be no friendships, only respect. That respect itself became a weapon of influence. Over time, the breakfast table became a classroom. The prisoners watched how the guards cleaned the kitchen, rotated duties, and shared the same food without hierarchy. They saw a democracy in miniature, order without tyranny. For women raised in a militarized empire, that was perhaps the most disarming lesson of all. In every war, victory tests not only armies but conscience. For the United States, the treatment of prisoners was a statement of identity. The government wanted to show the world, and itself, that democracy could hold its moral ground even when surrounded by hatred. In the camps, morality was not taught in classrooms. It was practiced in kitchens. Serving hot food to the enemy at dawn was not sentimental. It was principle, codified in the Geneva Convention and reinforced by American self-image. But morality also had its costs. There were voices of resentment among American citizens who read newspaper reports about enemy prisoners eating well, while their own sons fought overseas. Letters reached Congress demanding stricter treatment. Still, military officials defended their policy. One colonel famously replied, "We are not feeding Germans. We are feeding proof that civilization still exists." For the prisoners, this moral stance was deeply confusing. They had been taught that enemies humiliate the weak. Yet here strength appeared in restraint. Some women began to write letters, censored but heartfelt, describing how the Americans behaved. Those letters reached German families, Red Cross offices, and even neutral journalists. The image of the brutal conqueror dissolved, replaced by a quieter portrait. The conqueror who cooked breakfast instead of issuing beatings. In that transformation lay the true victory, not of weapons, but of ideals. By the time spring returned, the camp was no longer haunted by silence. Laughter began to echo from the mess hall. Prisoners volunteered for kitchen duty, learned English words, and even baked bread for the guards. But as peace neared, the hardest moment was yet to come. The moment when the women would be told that they were going home. After years of fear, they would realize that leaving was harder than staying. The snow had fallen silently through the night, covering the barbed wire in white frost. When morning came, the camp looked almost peaceful, like a small town asleep under a blanket of winter. Inside the barracks, the women stirred at the sound of the bell. They moved slowly, their breath visible in the cold air. The war had ended months ago, but for them, peace still felt like something happening somewhere else. That morning, something was different. The guards' voices were softer. There was no inspection, no shouting, no counting of rations. Instead, the air carried a smell they hadn't known since childhood: bacon, coffee, and freshly baked bread. It drifted in waves through the wooden walls, tugging at memories buried under years of fear. When the doors opened, the women stepped out hesitantly. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they walked toward the mess hall. For the first time, they noticed small things. How one American guard brushed frost off the steps. How another smiled briefly before turning away. Inside, the warmth hit them like sunlight. Steam rose from giant steel pots. The hiss of eggs on the griddle mingled with the faint hum of a radio. The tables were already set. Rows of tin plates, cups, and bread stacked neatly in baskets. No one spoke. Then the cooks began to serve. Bacon first, crisp and glistening. Then pancakes folded in half. Syrup poured carefully by a sergeant whose hands looked more suited for a rifle than a ladle. One by one, the women moved through the line, eyes wide, as if expecting the meal to vanish the moment they reached for it. A nurse named Helga, no older than 25, stood frozen when her turn came. The American behind the counter, a young corporal from Kansas, looked at her for a moment, then said simply, "Ma'am, it's hot. Don't let it get cold." She nodded but couldn't speak. The word ma'am struck her harder than any order ever had. It was the first word of respect she had heard from a man in uniform since the war began. She took her tray and sat down. Around her, others did the same, moving slowly, unsure of the rules. Then came the sound that none of them expected, the first laugh. It came from the far corner, soft at first, then joined by another. Someone whispered that it felt like Sunday morning before the war. Helga took a bite of bacon. The salt burned her tongue. Her eyes filled with tears. She covered her face with one hand and wept quietly. Not from sorrow, but from the unbearable reminder of a life that once had warmth, family, and mornings like this. Across the room, an American lieutenant paused to watch. He said nothing, only nodded to the cook to keep the trays coming. For the guards, it was just breakfast. For the prisoners, it was redemption served on a plate. By the time everyone was seated, a strange silence filled the hall. Not fear, but stillness. The radio played a song from home, something cheerful and distant. Coffee cups clinked. A few women whispered thank you in broken English. Others simply ate, heads bowed. That morning became legend inside the wire. The smell of bacon at dawn was no longer just food. It was proof that war, even at its ugliest, could not erase humanity completely. The Americans called it routine. The Germans called it mercy. When the meal ended, the guards opened the doors. The women stepped back into the cold, their faces flushed from warmth and emotion. Over the fence, the rising sun caught the snow and turned it gold. Helga looked back once, holding the empty tray against her chest. "They fed us like people," she whispered. Another woman replied, "Maybe that's what winning looks like." But kindness is never one-sided. In the weeks that followed, those same women would begin to volunteer, in the kitchens, the infirmaries, the workshops, returning the gesture in quiet ways that blurred the line between captor and captive. It was then that both sides began to understand something deeper. That compassion, once released, doesn't stay behind barbed wire. The morning of the bacon breakfast had left an invisible mark across the camp. For days afterward, the guards noticed a change they could not quite define. The women stood straighter during roll call. Fewer arguments broke out in the barracks. Conversations replaced silence. And in the mess hall, where fear had once ruled, the sound of laughter returned, cautious at first, then genuine. Helga, the nurse who had cried into her bacon, asked the camp medic if she could help in the infirmary. She expected refusal, perhaps suspicion, but the sergeant nodded. "If you know medicine," he said, "you'll be more use inside than out." That small permission opened a door. Within weeks, more women joined, cleaning instruments, washing sheets, assisting with minor injuries. American guards came to trust their hands. In return, the women saw their captors not as faceless uniforms, but as young men far from home, often no older than their brothers. The winter dragged on. Supplies tightened and rations were reduced slightly for everyone, prisoners and guards alike. Yet somehow the kitchen stayed warm, the coffee still poured. One morning, when the Americans ran short on flour, the German women offered to bake bread from their own recipes, using cornmeal and oats. The results surprised everyone. A lieutenant later wrote in his report, "The prisoners baked like they were feeding family. Those loaves became symbols, not of surrender, but of shared survival." Each batch was divided evenly between the guards and the prisoners. The act was quiet, unrecorded, but it carried more weight than any treaty. In the middle of war's wreckage, people were rediscovering how to care for one another. The guards, too, began to soften in ways they could not admit aloud. Some learned to say Guten Morgen instead of Good Morning. Others brought old magazines from home or photographs of their families. There were no friendships, only moments, like the sergeant who fixed a prisoner's broken shoe, or the corporal who taught English words by pointing to objects in the kitchen. Helga once asked him why he was so kind. He shrugged. "Because one day someone might treat my sister the same." By spring, the snow melted and the fences looked less like cages, more like lines on a map waiting to fade. The women worked in the vegetable gardens, grew beans and onions for the camp kitchen, and even built birdhouses from scrap wood. When the first bluebirds returned, their song echoed across the compound, a sound that made even the guards pause. Then came the announcement everyone had both prayed for and feared: repatriation. The war was truly over. Trains would soon take them to ports where ships waited to return them to a homeland in ruins. The news spread through the camp like cold wind. Some cried with relief. Others fell silent. For all the hardship, this place had given them something the war had stolen: safety, dignity, and the taste of peace. The thought of leaving it felt like losing that peace all over again. On their final morning, the same cooks prepared breakfast. The same smell of bacon, the same steam rising through the air. But this time it was different. The women helped serve. They poured coffee for the guards, wiped tables, and quietly thanked the men who had once been their enemies. Helga walked to the same corporal from Kansas and handed him a folded note. It contained just one line. "When I smell breakfast, I will remember that mercy is stronger than fear." He folded it carefully, slipped it into his pocket, and saluted her. Not as a prisoner, but as a fellow human being who had endured. As the trains left the camp, the guards stood along the tracks. The women waved from the windows and faces pale but peaceful. The smoke from the engines mixed with the smell of burned wood and distant bacon grease from the morning fire. It hung in the air long after the last carriage vanished. In the silence that followed, the camp felt empty. The guards cleaned the kitchen, stacked the trays, and for a moment, one of them said quietly, "We'll never have mornings like that again." He was right. What had begun as an order, "Feed the prisoners well," had turned into something no policy could have designed. It had become proof that even in war, humanity, once awakened, refuses to die. When the German women returned home, they carried those memories into a broken nation. Journalists would one day ask them about their captivity, expecting stories of cruelty. Instead, many spoke of breakfast, of music, of the American cooks who smiled while serving food to their former enemies. Those recollections would ripple across Europe, shaping how the next generation viewed not only defeat but dignity. When the trains reached the shattered cities of post-war Germany, the women who stepped down were ghosts of two worlds. Behind them lay the order and calm of the American prisoner of war camps. Before them stretched streets of ash, bombed cathedrals, and hungry faces. The nation they returned to was barely breathing. Food was rationed to crumbs, coal was gone. Children scavenged through rubble for pieces of bread crust. To many of the returning prisoners, the silence of Germany felt harsher than captivity. They had expected anger or shame, but what they found was emptiness. The American camps had become, paradoxically, the last places where they had known warmth. And in that contrast lay the seed of a new understanding. Helga, the young nurse from Camp McCoy, returned to Hanover in the winter of 1946. She found her family home flattened, her parents missing. In a makeshift shelter, she began working as a volunteer medic for displaced children. At night, she would write in a small notebook, not about battles or borders, but about mornings. "The smell of bacon," she wrote, "means hope. It means someone is still choosing kindness." Other former prisoners echoed similar memories. Letters began circulating through the ruins, passed between neighbors, then through church groups, then to local newspapers. They spoke of American soldiers who served breakfast without hatred, who called them ladies instead of enemies. Those letters reached the attention of Allied occupation officers. When questioned by journalists, many women repeated the same simple truth. They fed us like people. In a Europe drowning in vengeance and loss, those words carried the quiet weight of peace. The United States Information Service later analyzed these testimonies in 1947, calling them spontaneous propaganda. They had not been scripted, yet they became powerful tools in rebuilding trust between former enemies. The reports concluded that humane treatment in American camps, especially the routine of fair meals, had accelerated reconciliation faster than any official negotiation. Historians now describe this as the soft victory. While armies won the war with weapons, America won memory with compassion. Each German who had eaten breakfast behind American fences carried home a living contradiction: that the conqueror had fed instead of starved, respected instead of humiliated. In the following years, this memory quietly shaped Germany's view of democracy. When Reconstruction began under Allied supervision, those who had once been prisoners often volunteered for civic work, teaching, nursing, rebuilding schools. Many admitted that their model of fairness came not from ideology but from observation. They had seen it in the way the American cooks shared food. The guards spoke calmly and the camp ran by rules rather than rage. A few even returned to the United States after the war as immigrants or exchange workers. Records from the late 1940s show former female prisoners applying for visas, citing admiration for American order and kindness. Some became nurses in American hospitals. Others housekeepers, translators, or wives to men who had once worn the same uniform that guarded them. Helga never returned, but her letters were published in a local Hamburg paper in 1948, under the title Breakfast in Captivity. The article drew thousands of responses. Women wrote back, sharing their own camp memories: the first sip of real coffee, the unexpected politeness of guards, the shock of hearing American music from a radio. Each story carried the same refrain: humanity had survived. For the United States, this unplanned moral diplomacy became a quiet triumph. When the Marshall Plan began rebuilding Europe, it encountered a population that, at least in part, no longer saw America as the faceless enemy from propaganda posters. Instead, many remembered the smell of breakfast drifting across barbed wire and the realization that civilization had not been completely destroyed. That was the echo of the morning meal, traveling from camp kitchens to political chambers, from memory to policy. It reminded both sides that peace was not signed on paper. It was practiced one act at a time, sometimes with nothing more than a plate of food. Not all stories were met with gratitude. Some fellow Germans accused the returning women of exaggerating, even betrayal, as if acknowledging mercy was itself disloyal. Others, scarred by harsher captivity under Soviet control, could not believe such kindness existed. In the coming years, those conflicting memories would collide, forcing the world to ask a harder question: could compassion survive once history began to forget? When the surviving German women tried to tell their stories, not everyone wanted to listen. The country they returned to had been split between guilt and grief. Millions of soldiers were still missing. Cities were rubble, and moral wounds ran deeper than bomb craters. In cafes and shelters, people whispered about hunger, about loss, about what the occupying powers might still take. But no one wanted to hear about kindness. For many, the idea that the enemy had treated captives well was impossible, even offensive. You were lucky, some said coldly. Others starved in the East. And they were right. In the Soviet zones, German prisoners were dying by the tens of thousands in freezing labor camps. The contrast between those horrors and the American camps was almost unimaginable. That contrast became a second war, a war of memory. To admit that mercy existed was to challenge the convenient narrative of universal victimhood. For years, silence was safer than truth. Some women locked their memories away. Others wrote anonymously in local newspapers, defending the belief that decency, too, had been part of the war's story. Historians now recognize that these testimonies helped shape the moral recovery of post-war Germany. They forced people to ask what it meant to be civilized, not in victory, but in defeat. In schools and churches during the 1950s, educators began quoting from those letters. They were not meant to glorify the Americans, but to remind Germans that moral strength could survive even inside a prison fence. Across the Atlantic, those same reports reached the United States. Former camp officers were invited to speak at universities. One of them, Captain William Trent of the Prisoner of War Administration, summarized it simply: "We learned that the right meal could calm 1,000 prisoners faster than 1,000 rifles. Food was truth. It told them who we really were." That philosophy quietly became part of American foreign policy. In the early Cold War years, when aid shipments and humanitarian programs spread across the globe, the underlying belief was the same: that generosity disarms more effectively than threats. Historians later called it the Bacon Doctrine. Helga's notebook, preserved by her family, was discovered decades later. In one passage she wrote, "History will count our wounds, not our breakfasts. But if the world ever wishes to understand how hatred ends, it must remember the mornings too." That line now appears in a small museum display at Fort McCoy, a single photograph of women standing in snow, steam rising from metal trays, eyes lifted toward a line of American cooks. There are no flags, no victory signs, only people, tired but alive, proving that even war could not devour every piece of kindness. Over the years, survivors' testimonies were recorded for archives in both nations. Almost every one of them, when asked what they remembered most, gave the same answer: the smell. Not the smoke of battle, not the oil of machinery, but the smell of bacon and coffee at dawn. It was the scent that crossed borders when words could not. By the 1980s, reunions began to take place. Former guards and former prisoners met again, gray-haired now, hands trembling as they shook. They spoke through translators or with fragments of remembered English and German. The conversations always began awkwardly but ended in silence, usually over shared food. At one of those gatherings, an elderly American cook was asked why he had shown kindness to people who once served the enemy. He smiled and replied, "Because someday, someone had to stop the war from eating breakfast." That sentence, like Helga's note, became part of the unofficial history of reconciliation. History would record battles, treaties, and numbers. But within the quiet of those camps, something intangible had happened. A reminder that nations are measured not only by how they fight, but by how they feed. Now the story narrows again, not to armies or politics, but to a single truth. When mercy becomes routine, it can outlive the men who ordered it and the fences that once contained it. In the long record of wars, victory is measured in cities taken, enemies defeated, and flags raised. But history has another kind of victory, one that leaves no parades, no headlines, no monuments. It is the victory of restraint. The victory of choosing mercy when cruelty is easier. In the American prisoner of war camps, breakfast became a quiet symbol of that victory. No grand speech announced it. No general planned it. It happened at dawn, in the hiss of a skillet, the pour of coffee, the passing of a tray from one trembling hand to another. It was here, in these small acts repeated across countless mornings, that the world saw a glimpse of what civilization could be when the guns finally fell silent. The German women had arrived expecting vengeance. They found discipline instead. They expected punishment. They found order. They expected hatred. They found breakfast. That simple routine to feed the defeated with dignity carried more power than any weapon forged during the war. It proved that strength need not shout, and that humanity once offered has a way of multiplying. Years later, when the same women spoke of their captivity, they did not recall the fences or the guards. They remembered the smell of bacon, the warmth of the mess hall, the moment fear began to loosen its grip. Perhaps that is how wars truly end, not when treaties are signed, but when the first meal is shared without hate. For in that fragile hour of morning, between the smoke of destruction and the steam of breakfast, humanity found a way to recognize itself again. The story of those German prisoners reminds us of something easily forgotten, that the greatest test of victory is not how you defeat your enemy, but how you feed them afterward. And in that quiet dawn, the United States passed that test, not through might or glory, but through the simple, enduring mercy of a hot meal served to a former foe.